I'm Chris Bailey, Instana CTO, and I am joined by Sven Hettwer for the second edition of Inside Instana, where we're going to be talking about application logging. So Sven, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Chris, for having me. I'm Sven Hettwer, and I'm the technical lead of the Instana Logging platform.
Okay, so Instana, traditionally hasn't really had log support, but it's something that we've been working on for a while.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the level of support that's there for logging in Instana today.
Yeah, so in Instana, we really value contextualization of data. So our first approach on logging was to make sure to contextualize logs with all the information we have in Instana as well. So when you ingest logs into Instana, they will be correlated to trace information as soon as or if available, and it will also be correlated to infrastructure information if available. And in an ideal use case, and we can have a look in a minute, you will be provided with all the information from trace, like the actual trace and the endpoint that was called, and also Kubernetes entities and such things.
That correlation, that getting logs in context is pretty unique, right? It relies on the fact that we have 100% capture of every trace record.
Correct.
And for application logs, we're actually capturing it as part of the trace record.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. So my understanding is that means that whenever we get a log message, if it's in the scope of a request, we have that request.
Correct. Yes.
And when we have that log record, we also have things like the stack trace. For the log record, we have where in the trace it occurred, and that gives us a level of detail and a level of insight that no one else has.
Yeah, this is especially true for our tracer implementations. So when you install the Instana agent, there is a technology called traces, and they will collect all the information associated to that trace, including log messages and also the stack traces and such. Well, it depends a little bit on your specific scenario, right? So when you're ingesting logs from a Kubernetes cluster using one of the container sensors, for example, we don't have that insight into the trace, so that information might be missing. But as soon as traces are involved, we have the full visibility.
Okay.
It all depends on the context.
And does that mean we kind of automatically get logs from applications without having to go in, configure, I need to collect standard out, standard error, they're in this file, etc.?
Yeah, so for container sensors, that's true. So currently we support Docker and Containerd. So when you enable that sensor to capture logs from containers, this will all be done automatically. For traces, we also support auto tracing and auto instrumentation for certain technologies like Java. For others, I think SDKs are required to basically provide their information in the source code as well, because we cannot do auto instrumentation because of technology and limitations on that level.
Fantastic. Right, let's take a look at it.
Sure. So this is actually the landing page of Instana, and when you go over here and click on Analytics and navigate to Logs, this is basically our main source of information. This is what we call unbounded analytics, and besides some quick filter and grouping capabilities on the left side, right? For example, you can just group by error and log, error and warning level, by log level. You could also look into the various levels that are available and see how many log messages are known to the system. You could also select certain services, right? So for that catalog demo, for example, we see now that this is filtered for catalog demo and we see only error logs, but you could also do the same for grouping, and in this case you would see all the logs associated to a certain service. And in this particular case, you would see in this region here that most of the logs are from the discount service, right? And let's say this is of interest, you could just zoom in and you see how the grouping and everything has changed.
Okay, so this is kind of like the log analytics view where we're starting from a logs perspective. The contextualization that we've got of the logs is what allows us to look at the log levels, the stream, the services.
Correct, right. So this is basically where you would slice and dice your log information to find your service or your log message of interest, right? You could also filter, for example, let's remove the grouping really quick. Remove grouping. So so now you see all the log messages as they are coming in, right? And here you could then, for example, also filter on the log message itself, right? And search for log message, that contains a certain word, let's say whatever you would put there, right? When you then open up the log message itself, you see all the contexts that we can provide for that particular log message, right? So in this case, you see the trace ID as mentioned previously, you see some endpoint information, you see the pod and the container, but that's not all. Let's find another one, which is maybe a little bit more contextualized. Because I would like to show this exactly, right? So this comes from a Kubernetes cluster, and we can see the whole Kubernetes infrastructure associated to it.
Okay, so this is the full set of context.
Yes.
We've got a trace ID, so it came in the scope of an end-to-end request.
Correct.
We even have the CPU memory utilization of the container at the time the log message was being created.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also have an indicator that shows we have certain issues in that namespace, right? So we look at that from every level.
Okay, so can we go and look at it in that scope of the end-to-end request?
Sure. So when we click here on the trace ID, everything is linked. We will hop over into the actual trace, and here we can also see the logs in context and where they occurred in the timeline of the request, right? So when we click here, we can see the infrastructure associated to it. We can see the log message, and we can see the stack trace of where the log message basically was produced, and when we click on it, we can even see the source code of the file to see what happened, right? So we see that in this context.
So I've got the end-to-end request. I get some things like parameters being used at the URL for REST requests and so on, and then I've got the line of code on which the log message was created. So I've probably got enough information to know exactly why that log message was created.
Exactly. Okay. Yes. If you come from another perspective, if you basically, so what you always could do is you could also look into the log details here, right? So we will provide the same amount of context in this tables here. So here you could see the cluster, for example. So let's say this is a trace, and you find something suspicious, and you have the idea it could be related to that certain deployment, right? You could click on the deployment, and you would see not only the deployment and how healthy it is as an infrastructure entity, but also the log messages it created in context to the resources.
Okay, so that's the reverse. We started off by looking at our logs and doing log analytics. This is more me starting by looking at a resource. So in this case, Kubernetes deployment, but it could be an application or a service. Okay.
Yeah, correct. So it really depends on the journey and where you start, right? So you could also start from a completely different perspective and navigate through the application perspective of Instana, right? Open up an application perspective, look at erroneous calls, and then explore the logs attached to these calls, right? So it really depends on the journey you're starting with.
Okay, that's fantastic. I mean, it gives us a huge amount of not just detail about the logs, but really the context as to why the log was created.
Correct.
Okay, so that's what you've been working on so far. What's coming next for logging?
Well, 2024 will be a brilliant year for IBM Instana in case of increasing logging capabilities. So we will start with general log collection. So as I said, we are currently limited. In the first iteration, we were limited to trace logs, so using the Instana agent instrumentation and container logs. Now we are working on general log ingestion, meaning based on OpenTelemetry, which is a very promising standard in the open source community, we will create opportunities for customers to ingest all kind of log messages, meaning application logs from Kubernetes, from OpenShift, you name it. We will include cloud providers like AWS and IBM Cloud, of course. We will include log file management for classic IT infrastructure.
Okay, so that essentially adds a complete logging capability to Instana. So
correct.
Today is kind of application logs, container logs, Kubernetes logs. this then widens it to, there should be no need to have any third-party logger in place.
Absolutely, right. And if you have third-party logger in place, or you plan to adopt OpenTelemetry, we will also support OpenTelemetry compliant interfaces to the outer world, basically, to the customer right away. So you don't even have to install an Instana agent anymore. You could go with an OpenTelemetry collector, for example, or instrument your applications with OpenTelemetry SDKs and then send the logs straight away to Instana.
That's awesome. Right. Exciting times for logging in
Absolutely.
Instana. Okay, so thank you for watching. Hopefully you found out some interesting stuff about the current state of logging and what's happening next in Instana. And thank you, Sven, for spending the time with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you.